It's a great pleasure to be here and actually privileged to have the opportunity to speak in such a renowned circle of people. I have 3 points to make in one slide, which you see over here. My point of departure is the observation that the most prominent works in the current literature on democracies or dying have surprisingly little to say about the role of culture in giving rise, stabilizing, or weakening autocratic and democratic regimes. The underpinnings of regimes are usually seen in the economic interests of certain elite factions or social classes, such as in the work of Ajimoglu and Robinson or Karl Bosch, or in international constellations when you think about the Wittgenstein way leverage and linkage. And some of the works on democratic backsliding, such as a recent review article by Alan Luss and David Waldner in the Review of Political Science, are actually openly dismissive of cultural explanations of what is going on here. And I find this a little bit counterintuitive, because for me democracy is an inherently normative concept that embodies, at least implicitly, very fundamental beliefs about human dignity, equality, liberty that address values in the first place. Second point, the few studies that do attribute a role to culture in regime dynamics, they usually look at the wrong things, and that is especially support for democracy. So, support for democracy, as I think I have shown in a couple of recent articles, one under the title Democracy Understood, another one under the title Democracy Confused. Support for democracy, we think we show, is an altogether misleading indicator that hides more than it reveals, because in many places, many people misunderstand democracy in authoritarian ways, and they confuse autocratic regime characteristics with democratic ones. And where that is the case, and this is quite frequently so, where this is the case, the meaning of support for democracy itself turns into its own negation. That is support for autocracy. Besides, we also have evidence that these misunderstandings are not just lies or fake answers or non-attitudes, but that they are real, because they correlate very closely with belief incorporating variables such as emancipative values. Those values I consider particularly important because I think they speak to the Enlightenment core of democracy's normative underpinnings, that is equality of opportunities and freedom of choice. And it also incorporates Ron's measure of post-materialism, so I always have seen emancipative values as the inverse of authoritarian values. Of course, these emancipative values correlate strongly negatively with authoritarian misunderstandings of democracy, and that is regardless of what regime type you are looking into. Third point, and that relates to this graph here, which I believe is quite powerful. Against this backdrop, I propose to bring back in congruence theory. That's the basic inspiration behind this graphic here. So this is not Freedom Rising, this is actually quite new work I'm doing right now. What do we see here? We see 98 countries that have been surveyed in the World Value Survey at least twice. So all the countries covered are included here. And what I did, I looked at the first point of observation, which is T1, and I looked at the last point of observation, which is T2. Explaining the vertical axis, because this is a little bit easier to understand. So I also digged into the DDEM data. And then you have, of course, a menu of choices that's almost endless, because they have liberal, egalitarian, electoral, participatory, deliberative, and so on and so forth democracy. What I did, I took the ones that are most plausible to me in the core definition of democracy, which is electoral, liberal, and participatory, and combined them in an index that I call comprehensive democracy. And on the vertical axis, we see to what extent and into what direction countries have been changing from the first to the last point of observation on that index. So these are change scores over time. So when it's going up, it's a move toward more democracy. When it's going down, it's a move toward more autocracy. And the larger the numbers are, to a more extent in this direction countries go. Now what we see on the horizontal axis is a little bit more complicated, but this is inspired by the idea of congruence. congruence, which goes back to Harry Eckstein and Ullmann and Weber, of course. The idea here is that for regimes to achieve stability or equilibrium, the culture must be compatible with the regime structures. But the idea of congruence also implies that there can be incongruence, so a misfit between culture and structure, or between culture and the regime. And this is what I try to measure here. So I go back to the first point of observation in each country, and I take emancipative values. Where is the country, the population on average scoring on emancipative values? And then I use this as a predictor of the comprehensive democracy level at that point in time. And then I get residuals. Positive residuals are positive misfits. That means the country is relatively too democratic compared to the level of emancipative values at that point in time. And the stronger that residual is, the more goes the misfit score to the right-hand side of that horizontal scale. So the more you go to the right, we see too much democracy, so to speak, in that situation at T1. And if we go to the left, it's the opposite. This is negative residuals. So those countries had at T1 too low levels of democracy compared to where the emancipative values of the population are. So if we relate these two measures to each other, we see that the direction and the extent of regime change operates as a function of the direction and extent of the regime culture misfit at the beginning of the observation. By the way, the time distances T1 to T2 vary from country to country because this is not harmonized. This is controlled for you. So the length of time that has elapsed from T1 to T2 is shown in here as a control variable. And I believe this is a very powerful confirmation of the original idea behind the congruence theory. And I also think this is powerful because here we have a framework that unifies explanations of both the direction and extent of regime change in a single scheme, portraying regime dynamics as a function of evolving regime culture misfits. So I'm continuing to work on this idea, making robustness checks and additional stuff. But I'm also very much in favor of what Pippa has proposed, that we need more questions in the future to cover autocratic legitimacy and its different facets. And this is truly on the agenda, I think. Thank you. Yeah, also thank you for those questions. Your question seemed to imply a little bit the question of whether this emancipatory value change has come to a halt or is even reverted. I don't see that really in the data. So this emancipatory trend is still going on, especially if we look at the generational pattern. It's still the younger people who are in the forefront here, it's the older people who are part of the backlash. But what has happened is that different population segments, talking about social class, because economic inequalities, we all know, have become bigger. But value polarization has also become bigger over emancipative values. So the average went up, but polarization has nevertheless increased because different population segments follow the trend with different speeds. And the lower and working class are kind of on the conservative end of those polarization, so left behind. And what we see right now is an over-mobilization of that population segment, which is not really a majority. It's actually shrinking over the generations, and over time one can show that. So it's a mobilization phenomenon that we have right now. It's not really a change in the values towards a more reactionary or conservative end. And according to my analysis, because of the generational pattern that we see in the data, the populist successes that we see right now, in my eyes, are already having an expiration date, given the generation pattern. Interestingly, we also have some evidence that dynamics of value change are changing over time. There's a good study from California, it's a panel study, that followed the increasing tolerance of homosexuality and gays and lesbians over time, over 30 years. And in the beginning, interestingly, it followed pretty much Ron's model. The change in values was the result of a change in the composition of the population, so generational replacement, and also a little bit in-migration, out-migration patterns. But people themselves did not change their minds. But when the majority point, when the tipping point was reached, that inflection point, when that became the majority culture, then you would see that the continuation of that value change towards more progressive tolerance was driven by intra-individual changes. So people would change their mind over time, which is interesting. I think when we look at, Pippa has shown this graph of the VDAM data, when we look at regime dynamics, what we see is a centennial ascension of democracy, but there's cycles. So it's a cyclical phenomenon inherently by its nature. And we know many such phenomena that have a cyclical nature. It's not only economic cycles, we know it from policy moods, as research, or we know Litzine and Soroka's thermostatic model of democracy. And when we have such cyclical effects, it has to do with disillusionment patterns that happen in repetitions. So there comes a trend, and everyone jumps on it because it's a trend. It has contagion effects. And high hopes are put in the new direction until we get disillusioned, and then it goes in the opposite direction until it turns again. And I think I can show in my analysis that the emancipative values are important both in an upward or in a downward cycle. When we have an upward cycle in democracy, the countries that are at the forefront of those values are the ones that are more likely to move more up. And when we have a downward cycle, as of now, the countries that have stronger emancipative values are less vulnerable to those backslides. Identity is an important point. You mentioned that. And Russia under Putin would be a very good example. Many of these autocrats shape a national identity frame where the geopolitical position of the country and its cultural belongingness is pitched in a pronouncedly non or even anti-Western way. And that is actually a part of the dictator's toolkit to keep those values low, because then the narrative would be those are Western values indeed. And they are actually a key marker of how far a Western identity has matured in a given society. So what we observe right now in many of these non-Western countries is a collision between two forces, because I think rising education, information, and so on and so forth is still a factor that drives these values, because when people learn to think for themselves, which usually is what education enables them to do, you do not want to be remote controlled and what to believe and what to do. And that creates appeal for those emancipative values. At the same time, popular dictators serve national sentiment with a national identity narrative that is pitched in an anti-Western way, and that puts the brakes on that process. So these identity questions, I think, are important, and we should think about how we can remodel our questionnaire in this regard.